Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Klitzman. I'm the director of the Masters of Bioethics program here at Columbia, and we're delighted to have a special guest with us today, and that's my friend and colleague, Dr. Joseph Fins. Dr. Fins is the E. William Davis Jr., MD, Professor of Medical Ethics and Chief of the Division of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medicine, where he's a tenured professor in medicine and has many other titles. He has a truly remarkable CV, and so I'm only going to mention a few of the many impressive things he's done. He is the founding chair of the Ethics Committee of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was appointed by President Clinton to the White House Commission on Complementary and Alternative Medicine. He has been on the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law. He's the author of over 500 papers, chapters, essays, and books. And his most recent volume is Rights Come to Mind, Brain Injury, Ethics, and the Struggle for Consciousness. And he's also the author of A Palliative Ethic of Care, Clinical Wisdom at Life's End. He's received many awards that I'm not going to have time to go through and all, but you look at his website, you'll be very impressed. Today, we're going to be talking about From Coma to Consciousness, Are We Worried? A conversation with Joseph Fins. And we see this as an interactive session. And for those of you online as well, please feel free to ask questions at any point. Just type them in the Q&A box. And I'll be talking to Joe for a while, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So please, if you're online, please feel free to type questions as well. And people in the room, please feel free to grab a lunch. So welcome.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So why the title, this title for this talk?
You wanted something interesting. I think it's really in response to an article that Daniela Lamas had published in the New York Times earlier this year, commenting on a paper that we published back in August of last summer about this thing called cognitive motor dissociation. And in the title, she said it was sort of like she was terrified by this. And so I'm sort of playing upon that sense of terror. Let me explain why I think she was frightened and why I think I'm excited and why I have the opposite impression of the problem space. So what is cognitive motor dissociation? Cognitive motor dissociation is basically a patient who appears unresponsive in a coma in the vegetative state. But when you put them in a scanner and you ask them to imagine playing tennis or walking through their house, they'll light up their motor strip as if they were doing a forehand or a backhand, or their spatial navigation areas. If you're asking them to go around their house, you can also do it with EEG, and you'll see an electrical signal. Jan Clausen here, for example, at Columbia, has done that work with EEG. So in our paper, which was published in the New England Journal, and which took us 16 years to do. Talk about, perseverance. And I give credit to my colleague, Nico Schiff, who's a neurologist who I've been working with for 28 years now. And that's another thing. If you can find a collaborator to work with in your career, it makes it a lot easier, a lot more fun, a lot more interesting. And it's kind of like climbing on a rock face. When one of you falls down, the other one can throw a rope and pull you up. So collaboration, which means co-laboring together, is a good thing. So we published this article, and we basically found in a large sample, which was international, that 25% of patients who had been in a coma or a vegetative state, who we thought were unresponsive, had cognitive motor dissociation. Now, we knew this existed for at least a decade through anecdotal experience, but it went from being kind of a niche issue that people who were in the field knew about and talked about to something that warranted publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. The other point I want to make, given the assault on science these days and the globalism versus nationalism issue, is this was an international study. We had colleagues from Liège in Belgium, Canada, the United States, and we all and in England, and we did this collaboratively, and we couldn't have done it in any single spot because we didn't have the volume of patients. So science, has to be international, and the knowledge flow has to be like a membrane where ions can cross channels back and forth. And we did it better together than we could have done individually. So I think, we talk about nationalism, we have to say, what's the effect of nationalism on science? This project would never have been done if only one country was involved. So anyhow, So in the article, the way the op-ed went was like, oh my God, look at these people. They have cognitive motor dissociation. They're aware, but nobody knows they're aware, and they're isolated, and they're sitting in an ICU, or they're sitting in a nursing home. And isn't that terrifying? It is terrifying. But my question is, isn't it more terrifying to have them there and not know they're there than to know they're there and perhaps do something about it? So I see the identification of CMD as a public health challenge that we need to do something about. And indeed, there are things that we can begin to do therapeutically to bring these people out of their shell, as it were. So that's the question. Why are we, are we frightened? Are we terrified?
I should say that Danielle Lamas was a alumni of PNS here and actually worked with her as her mentor at one point, though that was a long time ago. So I take no credit
Well,
for her.
she did more for the
Yeah,
paper than the publication in the New
right.
England Journal of Medicine. More people read the New York Times than New England
Yeah,
Journal
yeah.
of Medicine. It's a major source of medical knowledge.
So just following up on what you just said, so what should we be doing? There you are, if one is a neurologist
Right.
and you have patients who quote are in coma, what should we be doing today?
Well, I mean, I think we're going through this transition in psychiatry as well, where we're going from a kind of a descriptive nosology or diagnostic framework to one that's more mechanistic, right? And so, if you look at a patient and they're non-responsive, they fulfill the criteria for the vegetative state. But now we're understanding that there's an inner reality, right? It's kind of like, phenotype and genotype. All the peas in Mendel's garden were not the same, even though they might have been white. Some were heterozygote, some were homozygote. And we're beginning to understand that there's the analogy here to the endotype or a genotype to these folks. So I think we have to, take a good history. History still matters a lot. How did somebody get there? What does the structural imaging say? How long has it been? I mean, to write people off really early may be premature. We have to have I've written a piece about a call for temperance, as it were, when it comes to organ donation. Let people declare themselves. And then there are things that you can do at the bedside, like the Coma recovery scale, which is a behavioral metric, which is a real evolution and improvement on the Glasgow coma and outcome scales, because it really looks at disorders of consciousness. If you're in a kind of a squishy area and you're not sure, then we can move into, EEG or fMRI. The challenge is, most places don't have a cyclotron and they're not going to be able to do the fMRI, and they're hard to read. And so you need expertise. So one of the things that people are thinking about, including Jan Klassen here, and a group called the Curing Coma Campaign, which is a national effort to improve the care for these patients, is somehow linking up places like Columbia, Cornell, Mass General, Harvard, places that do sophisticated EEG work. And a small community hospital could do a regular old EEG, send it over the internet, and there'd be an algorithm, and we would be able to sort of figure out whether or not there was evidence of covert consciousness in a cost-effective, accessible way. Why is this important? If you have CMD, it means you have intact neural networks.
Just say, repeat, CMD is,
Cognitive motor, for the folks at home,
yeah,
cognitive motor
right.
dissociation. There's folks who are just joining us now after the commercial break, right? It's like CMD is cognitive motor dissociation. And if you have that, it means you're processing information in an integrated way. And it also means that you have a better prognosis, right? Because if you're vegetative and you're vegetative and you truly vegetative, you have what's called a disintegrated neural network. So the networks are not connecting with each other. Then you can't activate those networks and treat them therapeutically. One way to think about the brain is that it operates in cortical thalamic cortical tracts. The thalamus to all of us is like the center of our universe, where it's a Copernican sort of revolution. The thalamus is at the center of our universe. And the thalamus is important because it looks down into the brainstem where it gets energy and activation, and then it splays up. It's the primitive brain. Before we had a cortex, we had a thalamus. And so it's got wide distribution. So the brain is organized in cortical thalamic cortical tracts, and there are loops. And the thalamus is to the brain what Hartsfield Airport is to Delta Airlines. It's a hub. You can't get there from here, right? But what happens in people who have CMD or the minimally conscious state, people who are not in the vegetative state, they have networks that are intact, okay, but they're not active, right? So that the highways are there, but there's no traffic. So the question is, how do you put traffic on the highways to allow for the exchange of information and a higher level of cognitive functioning. And there are a number of ways to do that with drugs and devices.
So what does that mean that their highways are there, but there's no traffic? So let's say I'm a person who has a cognitive motor dissociation. I'm blind and I can't move, and you say move, I can't.
Right.
But
Well,
my mind,
those people have traffic. It's just that we can't, it's not manifesting itself behaviorally.
okay.
Right. Right.
So what is
That's
that?
the name, cognitive motor
Right.
dissociation. Right.
So uh to be blunt, how awake are those people? I mean, are they sitting there thinking, how come no one's listening to me? Are they dreaming? Or do we know? Or do they?
We don't necessarily know, and that's one thing that BCI could help tell us if we could somehow extract what they were thinking. And the question that I always
I
get,
say what BCI is.
brain computer interface.
Right.
The question I always get after I give a talk about our work on people who are in the minimally conscious state is like, what were they thinking when they were there? Well, if they remembered it, they wouldn't probably have been in the minimally conscious state, because the most fragile
Right.
thing that we have, think about Alzheimer's and the hippocampus, is our memory.
Right.
And it's the first to go. Like, I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, right? That's because it's fragile.
Today you'll remember.
I'll remember because I know I haven't had lunch yet, but it's there. Right. No, I had a fish witch from Wenwich. Okay, I do remember. I just, for the folks who are wondering about this. So the answer is, the range, though, in people who have CMD, it's not just people in minimally conscious state. They could be low level MCS. MCS is the minimally conscious state. And these are people who are definitely conscious, but they evidence consciousness episodically and intermittently. They might, reach for a cup. They might say their name. They might look up when the doctor comes into the room, but they don't do it all the time. So they're often misdiagnosed as being vegetative. And there are two kinds of MCS. There's negative, right, and positive. Positive have language, but the language is episodic, all the way up to the locked in state,
Right.
like the diving bell and the butterfly. So that's the range of CMD.
Right.
Physiologically. Now, I would say there's another aspect of CMD, which I've written about, and that's the sociologically determined CMD. Whereas if you look, you'd see it, but nobody seems to care. Nobody wants to go there. And there's this history of nihilism against these people, which I need to explain for a second, because the right to die in America grew up in severe brain injury. You think of Quinlan, Cruzan, and Shivo, right? These were people who had no future. They weren't ever going to get better. So in Quinlan, the right to die was established because, as Dr. Plum, my teacher at Cornell, who was the co-originator of the vegetative state and examined Karen and Quinlan, said that, there was loss of a cognitive sapient state. And that loss led the judge in New Jersey to say, okay, we can withdraw her ventilator. Of course, she lived because she had an intact brainstem and she was vegetative. She wasn't, she could breathe on her own.
So getting back to what one might say, well, how do you know they're actually conscious? Let's just say I say play tennis, and somehow
Right.
those words are what's activating,
Right.
part of the brain, but they're not actually thinking now
Well,
I'm playing tennis. Or
right. So we don't, I don't know you're conscious, right? How could I know?
because I'm telling you.
Well, you're telling me, but that's your, but I don't really know, right? So I know you're nodding when I say something. The only consciousness that we know is our own, right? So the question is, do we know if animals are conscious? I mean, that's a deep question. Okay, but we have a kind of operational definition in the context of neuroscience and neurology in this field. And we take a volitional response as dispositive for consciousness. So if I ask you to imagine playing tennis in your head, right? You have to hear what I'm saying. You have to know what I'm saying. You have to translate that. You have to imagine doing it. And it's an active response versus a passive response. And when we do that with people who don't have disorders of consciousness, and we do it with people who do, there's a correlation of the areas that light up. However, having said that, it's not foolproof, right? And some people who are conscious may not do it, may not want to do it. They may not want to do the task. So a negative test is not definitive, but a positive test can be a game changer.
So what are the implications for ethics?
Well, for ethics,
findings,
the implications for ethics is that now that we know, we can't look away, right? Ignorance is bliss until it's not, until we know. So I think it has a number of really important clinical implications. One is we have to think about the obligation for surveillance, brain injuries are not static, and people change over time. They rewire, things change. We can talk about rewiring later, but there needs to be a kind of a longitudinal assessment of these people, because they may come out of the hospital in the vegetative state and move into the minimally conscious state in a nursing home, and there's no surveillance there, and they are in CMD and nobody knows it because nobody's looking for it. And the problem is, if somebody comes out of a fancy medical center where they had neurologists and neurosurgeons with a diagnosis that they're in the vegetative state, and they go to a small nursing home in New Jersey or Long Island, I want to be ecumenical here because there's, Billy Joel and Springsteen. We have to divide the world, right? Wherever you guys like that, wherever I don't know, Springsteen or Billy Joel.
Yes.
They're both okay. It's a mixed,
All right.
the mixed bag here. Okay.
Luckily, we're between the two, so.
Right. So in that place where that little nursing home, and the family says, I think I saw Joe looking up when I came into the room. The geriatrician or the internist or the family doctor, often who's not trained in neurology, who's never heard of much of this, perhaps, is going to say, but no, but the people at Columbia said that she was vegetative. It's impossible for this person to be responding, right? So they don't get evaluated. So I'd want to improve that. And if I was the brain injury czar or of the world, or even the United States, I would probably spend money on some kind of periodic surveillance on these people to make sure that nobody had gone from the vegetative state into a higher level of function. And I should add that the categories have changed. As of 2018, there's no such thing as the permanent vegetative state. It was changed to the chronic vegetative state, because 20% of people who were permanent can morph into a higher brain state. And that could be for a number of reasons. One, they were misdiagnosed. The misdiagnosis rate is about 40%. So they really weren't even in the vegetative state, but now we know that they're, say, minimally conscious. The second is there's this phenomenon of axonal sprouting and pruning, which we've demonstrated at Cornell and imaging and others, where people actually who've had these severe injuries grow white matter tracts that sprout and prune. What does that sound like? It sounds like development. It's the same process that happens in the maturing brain. So the injured brain is recapitulating a developmental mechanism in the service of repair, which is really amazing to me. It's really cool. The reason we're seeing this now, this whole epidemic of people who have these disorders of consciousness, is because over the last 20 years or so, we're treating brain injury differently. Until then, you have a really bad brain injury, your brain swells, it herniates, it goes through the foramen magnum, and you die, right? And that was how it was. Now we have ventilators. Now we do, we do the craniectomies, and we put shunts in. So we manage the pressure. The brain swells outside of the cranium. They don't die. They don't herniate. They have a devastating injury. And over a period of time, stem cells are probably turned on that begin this sprouting and pruning thing. So the brain structurally looks different over time, and we've demonstrated it. The woman in my book, Maggie Worthen, whose name I had permission to talk about from her mom, there was a study that showed her brain over a 54-month period where she had improved white matter tracts across the hemisphere and in Broca's area that correlated with her ability to use an eye tracking device and communicate. So at 0 months, she couldn't do it. By 54 months, she could, and there were structural changes in the brain that undergirded that new capability. So I'd like to be able to evaluate patients over time to make sure that we're identifying consciousness. That would be really important.
So how would we surveil the patients? So we do the EEG if you're at a local hospital and somewhere within a 50-mile radius of here, east or west.
Right.
We would have EEGs.
I mean,
have them
this doesn't exist yet,
Right.
right? But the idea would be that people like Jan Kloss and Nico Shiv, Brian Edlow up at MGB, folks like that, we would come up with an algorithm to do an EEG that was simple and effective. They transmit it, and we would look to see whether there was evidence of cognitive motor dissociation. The challenge is, and this is another, I don't mean to get political, but the challenge is that all this depends on the NIH, right? So I'm talking about last year, not this year. And I think it's so important to be an advocate for science and evidence-based science. All of this work I'm telling you about has in large part been done by investigators who have been funded. I've been funded by the NIH. I have a grant right now, which is we're not sure its status, right? So it's really important that when we talk about the future, we're aware of the present realities and what needs to be done. And all of us as citizens have to be advocates for science.
So what does that mean concretely? So what should happen to move what's happening in terms of cutbacks?
So they just cut funding for traumatic brain injury in the budget. I know nothing's final, but this is a tenuous space, and this population has historically been marginalized, and so these things take resources. So I think there are two areas, right? There's on the diagnostic side, which relates to public health surveillance, and then on the therapeutic side, developing therapies that are effective. Now, one of the things that we've been involved in is neuromodulation, right? So that is, we talked about the thalamus being sort of very important. So we've actually done direct thalamic stimulation, and we did that for the first time in 2007. We published that in Nature. This was a patient who was in low-level, minimally conscious state, didn't have speech, sometimes could move their eyes in response to command. That was it. With bilateral thalamic it's like I'm putting them in bilateral. I don't do this part, right? We have neurosurgeons. Bilateral thalamic stimulation in the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus. This patient who couldn't speak could say 6 or 7 word sentences, say the first 16 words of the Pledge of Allegiance. He could go to Old Navy and choose clothes with his mother. He could tell his mother he loved her. And I wrote about him, and his name was Greg Pearson in my book, Rights Come to Mind. And so that work has matured to last in 2023. We published in Nature Medicine a study of patients in moderate, or participants in moderate to severe brain injury who were able to communicate, who could actually give their own consent as independently assessed by a colleague who was a psychiatrist. This was done out with Cornell and Stanford and other collaborators, and they had improvements in their cognitive functioning in what I think called Trails B. So it's processing speed, executive function, 1 or 2 points in some patients on their Glasgow outcome scale, which is unheard of after 3 months of stimulation. So people who were unable to go to work or unable to go to school were able to begin to do things that they had not imagined previously. One subject who went public was going to go to grad school, was in a horrible car accident, and was out for almost 20 years. Not out completely, but that was her accident. And she started to read novels again. In the interim, she read 6 novels. So I had, I should say, a side grant from the NIH, for which I'm grateful, to actually interview the patients and their families. I use patients, but they're subjects, patients and their families before and after enrollment in the study. So part 1, this is all published in Cambridge Quarterly, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 was like, why did you sign up? What were you thinking? Was there a therapeutic misconception? How was it?
These were patients who were in what state?
They were people who were deemed able to give consent and who were going to participate in the DBS trial, moderate to severe brain injury. They're euphemistically called the walking wounded. When you see them on the street, you don't necessarily know that they have a disability, but they have fatigue. They're often labile. They don't have concentration. If 2 things are happening at the same time, they can't focus. They get headaches. They can't keep a job. And so with this study, we interviewed them and their families, so to triangulate this before and after. And one of the interesting things afterwards, it was this. There's a hack in neuroethics. There's this idea, right, that you're going to get these prostheses and your brain is going to be hacked. People say you're going to lose your cognitive liberty, right? And so we asked about that. It turns out brain injury steals your identity. This intervention restored their identity, and they became more of who they were before their injury than they had been. For example, they say, when I was injured, I was like, one guy said, one of the subjects said, I was like a teenager, but now I'm more like my old age, not old age, but his former age. Family members say they got their sense of humor back. So it was restorative. And this was the same technology that we did back in 2007 in the minimally conscious state. We're now doing in people who had moderate to severe brain injury. And I think it's important to stress why we did one before the other, because when we did it in the minimally conscious state, we were doing it in people who were as injured as they could be and still potentially benefit from the intervention. They had intact neural networks, but the possibility of further injuring them was minimal or marginal. Whereas if we did it in someone who had already recovered to a higher brain state, a bad intervention could have brought them back down to a lower state. So this study that we did and published in 2023 is really the granddaughter of that earlier study that we had to do it incrementally, and show that we could be doing it safely and effectively in the more damaged population, with damage vis-a-vis their injury. And now we did it with this population. And of the 6 people who were enrolled, 1 was explanted for a minor infection. All 5 of them had at least a 10% improvement in Trails B, which was the biomarker for improvement. But what's interesting, and this I think speaks to the role of bioethics and narrative ethics, and I know Rita Sharon does a lot in narrative ethics here. So and I do too. And we were sitting around designing the study, and we said, okay, does anybody care about a 10% improvement in Trails B? Have you ever heard of that?
Just say what Trails B is.
It's like an executive. Well,
yeah.
they don't know. That's the point. That's my point. They don't care. This doesn't turn their, their cortex on, right? But if somebody says, now I can read 6 novels, that
Right.
so we thought, like, what happens if we don't hit the metric? Or people say they're better, but we don't, the metric was wrong. How can we, ensure that we get this additional complementary information? So we did the narrative studies, and I worked with Megan Wright, who was a law professor at Penn State, former student at Yale Law School with me, and she's also a sociologist. So we did inductive coding and the like, and we were able to demonstrate that kind of improvement. But the stories were compelling.
Yeah.
And it was one of the hardest things I ever did, because we had all these transcripts, and each one of these stories, initially I would say, like on executive function, patient A said this, patient B said this. It would have been dreadfully boring. So I had to write short stories for all 5 of them, because it was really contextualized within each of their lives and their families. And then we had the triangulation. So what the patient thought, how they did, may not, we had the data. How do they do on the testing, right? The actual testing, and what do their family members say? So we did a 360 around the problem space, and there were multiple ways of knowing. I'm writing a book about Lewis Thomas, and I'd love you all to read it, but first I have to write it. And Lewis Thomas, I stumbled upon a letter that he wrote recommending Fred Plum for the Century Club in New York, which is one of these fancy clubs in New York. And it was in Walsh McDermott's papers, another famous physician. And so Lewis Thomas, who was, he was dean at NYU and Yale, president of Memorial Sloan Kettering, won 2 National Book Awards and a Lasker Prize, which described him as the poet laureate of 20th century American medicine. So he's writing this letter about Fred Plum, the guy who co-discovered the vegetative state with Brian Jeanette. Brian Jeanette, by the way, is responsible for all the Glasgow scales, right? So the 2 of them. And he's saying, Fred Plum is a 2 cultures kind of guy, invoking C.P. Snow's book on the 2 cultures, the sciences and the humanities. And then Lewis Thomas adds, if you believe that, which I don't. I read that and I go, like, why wouldn't Lewis Thomas be a 2 cultures kind of guy? He's sciences and humanities. He wrote beautifully. He was a credible scientist. He came up with immune surveillance for cancer. Interesting guy. And I realized the reason he said that was, for Lewis Thomas and this study, there's one culture. That my narrative work and the scientific work were 2 ways of knowing about the same thing. And the world is not divided between the sciences and the humanities if they're focused on the same thing. And so it's a unified vision of how information from all sources, if it illustrates a problem, they're both legitimate, and they're co-equal, and they're important. So that's why initially I thought I was a 2 cultures guy, but I think Lewis Thomas was right. It's really one culture. And if we really want, and there really aren't, problems don't require multiple ways of knowing. And so I think the beauty of my collaboration with Nico Schiff, who was, by the way, a history of science major at Stanford, so he has a lot of humanities DNA himself, is the ability to collaborate and have additive information that allow us to understand the lived experience of these patients and their families.
Two small comments. One is there are some people who've argued that we actually have three cultures because there's science, there's social science,
Yeah,
and there's humanities,
right.
just as an FYI.
Well, yeah. So is that a question or a comment?
No, just a comment.
Okay, because I have an answer. To make it a question mark. So
Like
it's interesting. Well, it's interesting, and Robin Cook will enjoy this. I don't know if you were there, but when C.P. Snow was at Wesleyan in the early 60s, he came to the Center for the Humanities where, Hannah Arendt was. She wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem was there. Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It was a really amazing place. So C.P. Snow gave a talk in the chapel at Wesleyan. I don't know if you went to that or not, or it was before I'm not sure exactly when you were there, but this was in the 60s. And he wrote about a bridging intermediary culture between the sciences and the humanities. And later on, he wrote a follow-up to the two cultures, which was published in 1959. And then I think the follow-up was like 63 or 64 or something like that. And I wrote a paper about this, having looked at the archives at Wesleyan. I like archives. And we celebrated the 50th anniversary of C.P. Snow. And I posited this point that bioethics is that intermediary bridging culture between the sciences and the humanities, and that bioethicists who are good scholars have to learn about the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences and be kind of trilingual in those three domains. So I think that C.P. Snow was on to overcoming the dichotomy.
Yes, right. And I agree with you about bioethics in our master's program here, as you know.
It's a very fine master's program, by the way. Yes.
Okay, here's your $5 for saying
Okay.
that.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you also teach at Yale Law School, and there are legal
Right.
implications of the work you've been doing. Do you want to talk about what some of those legal implications are?
Right. So going back to my book, which was called Rights Come to Mind. Initially, when I was writing it, I was going to talk about the financial structures that imperiled access to care, insurance, and the like. And that's still there as a problem. But then I realized that these folks were disabled, and that there are laws that protect people with disabilities. So I tried to recast the conversation, that the care that we're not providing these people is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the mandate of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is to maximally integrate people into civil society. So when you read the history of the civil rights movement, in fact, Hubert Humphrey, when he went back to the Senate after being vice president, I believe he had a granddaughter with Down syndrome, wanted to modify the Civil Rights Act to include protections for people with disability. And this was during the Nixon administration. And they said, if you start fuddling around with the Civil Rights Act, we had Lyndon Johnson in 1964, this whole thing could fall apart. So let's not do that. So in 1973, they wrote the Rehab Act, which was succeeded by the ADA in 1990. So one of the things that I've been doing with law students at Yale is writing law review papers, arguing for the legal basis for social integration under the ADA. And we started talking about the ADA. Olmstead enforcements, which enforced the ADA, was a decision in 1999 at the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, another Columbia alum from the law school, wrote the majority opinion. And the idea was, and she used the word segregation, that people need to be integrated. It was a case of two women who were in a Georgia mental hospital, who were ready to be deinstitutionalized, which would cost more than being institutionalized in a community setting. And the state of Georgia said, we can't afford it, we can't do it. And the Supreme Court in Olmstead said that you have to maximally integrate people. And unless you're a mom and pop shop and you can't put an elevator in your store, Georgia could clearly do that. And so there's now the Justice Department, when we have a Justice Department, do a thing called Olmstead enforcing the ADA. But we didn't stop there at Yale Law School with my students. We've also written more recently not only about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we proposed, this is just a proposal, the AWAA, the Americans with Abilities Act, right? And the challenge here is that when you give somebody an intervention that makes their condition mutable, right? Mutable, changeable,
Yeah.
they get less protection
Mm.
under civil rights law.
Right.
So race is protected more than gender. Gender can be more fluid. You know, if I change the color of my shirt, we wouldn't protect people who wore white shirts, right? So mutability and legal protection. So that would be paradoxical. We can make you better with a deep brain stimulator, right? We can improve your function, make you less disabled, and give you less protection, but you now have different sets of needs. So we said the ADA is important, but we also have to think about the Americans with Abilities Act to foster what Martha Nussbaum and Armentina Sen talk about, improving capabilities that allow for human flourishing. So we're beginning to explore that avenue and why we need to not only protect people from discrimination, but give them the opportunities to succeed. And in the paper that we first AWAA paper, which we published in Boston College Law Review, one of the challenges is, how does the government organize care for these people jurisdictionally? Right? When you start off your care, you're in a hospital, you're covered by Health and Human Services. As you progress, it's housing, HUD. Then you get into education. And there's all kinds of opportunities to fall out of the regulatory space. And of course, justice is all along because of enforcement of things like the ADA. So we laid out an idea for a sub-cabinet group that would be a coordinating council for people who had severe brain injury, which could be a model for other folks, other kinds of disability. So we've written, about 20 articles over the last 10 years with law students. And now, hopefully some of them will end up on the Supreme Court, because they have a tendency to do that, and we'll inform the world that way. But teaching up there has been wonderful with the law students.
That's great. So I want to give a chance for people in the audience to ask questions. So people in the room here, if you want to raise your hand, and people online, feel free to type a question in the Q&A, and we'll go back and forth. So let me start. Any question? I have other questions I can ask, but questions in the room? Yes. Oh, actually, we're going to have you talking to the mic here.
Hi, thank you so much. Great talk. I'm Lawrence Melnicker. I'm an emergency physician at Brooklyn Methodist, part of the NYP system, and that's how I met Dr. Finns during COVID. The whole discussion is kind of mind blowing. It's really, and I guess it's meant to be mind blowing. But the work you're doing is shattering, or has the potential to shatter, prior standards of care.
Right.
And one thing you and I spoke about, and I read the task force report from New York State, is about the fact that we're not permitted to shatter standards of care during things like COVID. The idea of emergency standards of care is still not legal in the state of New York, which is why the governor had to give us some umbrella protection. I'm wondering how this fantastic work that you've been doing on brain injury can be leveraged so that we can get to a better place in terms of establishing emergency standards of care. I mean, this year alone.
Actually, let me just interject for a second. The standards of care that were established in other states and could have been established here were using, and I wrote a piece in a disability journal, how they were actually using the wrong metrics. If you look at the SOFA scores, right, this sequential organ failure assessment tool, which we haven't said for a few years, right, and they're different color schemes, right. If you're green, you don't need a ventilator. If you're red, you have one single organ that's in trouble, and if you got a ventilator, you're likely to survive. Yellow, we're not, maybe two organs, we're not sure, and blue, no matter what you did, you were going to die. So that was the color scheme based on, I think, 5 parameters, from platelets to coagulopathy to PO2 and things like that, and you get a score. The problem, including the Glasgow Coma scale. And the problem is that some of our patients with brain injury would go in de novo with a score that, or without any other additional organ system problem, would end up being red. If they had anything else wrong with them, they'd be yellow. and they would be precluded from getting a ventilator. So in fact, the papers, the point of this paper, which was pretty granular and arcane, even I would admit that, it showed that they were using the wrong metrics and there was implicit discrimination. States like Nebraska, for example, had the COVID testing. Remember you had to drive into a COVID, testing area. And if you were disabled and you didn't have a car, how did you get tested? So I think that in times of emergency, these people are doubly and triply vulnerable. And when I was on the task force on life and the law, and we were writing about earlier on, we were talking about avian flu, and Adrian Ash, a blessed memory, was on the task force, person with disability scholar. We were talking about the ventilator. If people are chronically on a chronic ventilator, and we're trying to pool ventilators during a public health emergency, what happens to that ventilator? And what we decided after some discussion was that ventilator is theirs. If they need to go onto a hospital ventilator, then they're in the pool with everybody else. But that ventilator doesn't get commandeered into the common pool because that is what they need for everyday living. So I think people with disabilities during the pandemic had a really hard time. I was part of a project that was published in the Hastings Center report, where we actually wrote about crisis standards of care as seen from a disabilities perspective. Guidry Grimes was the first author. I was the last author. A whole bunch of folks, and it looks very different than the standard sort of utilitarian view. I think we have to, if we're in a pandemic again, and we will be, because that's what happens, right? We have to remember that what we do in the moment will be judged by history. Thucydides wrote about the plague of Athens, right? And there was a degradation of norms, or nomos, in ancient Greece. And he recorded that as, I think, a reminder that we have to live with our history. And so I think in the moment, the expediency of a crisis, utilitarianism can really violate some deontological and important truths that we have to hold fast.
Thanks.
We have a question online. I'm going to go back and forth here.
All right, so our first online question comes from Karen Sobek. So does the frequency of CMD raise concerns about patients undergoing donation after cardiac death? And how should donor families be educated about the phenomena as part of informed consent for transplantation of their loved one?
Well, I think non-regional perfusion transplantation. I wrote about this with Matt DeCamp and Lois Solmesi Snyder with the American College of Physicians. I think consent for NRP is a really complicated thing. And notwithstanding the complexity of violating the dead donor rule, ligating carotids and the like, I think abdominal non-regional perfusion is not controversial because it doesn't require that reversal of the dead donor rule, and you're just perfusing locally in the abdomen. But the question in the context of donation after circulatory death, these are patients who do not have circulatory function. They're usually sick from other reasons, and I don't think the issue of CMD would likely come up in that context.
Okay, back to the room. Yes.
Hi, I have a couple questions and I want to
Speak
go.
a little louder if you don't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better?
Yeah.
All right. Hi, my name is Camille. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the range of function, and I was specifically interested in the activity. And when you were talking about that, I wasn't sure if you meant that the thought process that was going on in people who were experiencing cognitive motor dissociation were just doing the process of what it's like when we're thinking as like human beings. Is that the activity that is being recorded, or is it something that is tangible for them that they experience when you mentioned something about tennis, that sparked something for them specifically? So I guess I'm trying to understand.
A lot of this is inferential, right? So like if I'm actually playing tennis and doing backhand, my motor strip will light up, right? If I think about playing tennis right now, my motor strip will light up.
Okay.
Right. So all we know, right, is that if I asked you to do it and you had CMD, right, and I asked you to do that, we had you in the scanner, that same motor strip would light up.
So
Now,
just like the thought process you're saying.
well, you're doing several things, right? So you're following command, and you're doing something volitionally yourself. Sometimes your brain will light up. If I simply say your name, we can get an activation. If it's passive, you're actually doing something. You're processing information. So I don't really know, like, I don't know Bob is conscious. I don't really know what's going on. Well, we think, we'll give you credit. But, you know, we think that this person is at least at some point understanding the command and following through. And we take that as a proxy for consciousness, right? But we really don't know what they're thinking. You know, it's funny, you know, we were talking about platelets, for example. When I first read about platelets in high school biology, I thought I understood what platelets were. When I learned about it in medical school, in hematology class, I thought when I became a resident and I became an attending, platelets meant different things as I evolved. But at least I knew they were small little things and they helped to clot, right? And it got more and more complicated as time went on. So we really don't know how, you know, deep they're thinking. We do know, for example, like Maggie Worthen, who was in my book, was a swimmer. So instead, and she was a competitive swimmer. So instead of asking her to play tennis, we asked her to imagine swimming,
Yeah.
right? Because it might be more philic to her past history.
I guess just to follow up on that, I guess in the realm of theoretical therapies and how we would go about that, I just was wondering in how exactly how specific care we would want to tailor things to that specific patient. Like for say, for example, the swimmer, would we
Right.
try to inspire as much of that and how
Right.
time
That's a great question. I think the more we know about who they were before their injury, the better we can treat them during and after their injury, right? So so in this case, we got a better response to swimming. We know, for example, in earlier studies where we were asking people who we thought we were trying to decide were they minimally conscious or vegetative, we would play family narratives. Right. So it could be Bob. Remember when we were little and mom took us to the beach and blah, blah, blah. And then you would play that same tape forwards and backwards. So it's the same frequency spectrum. And you would see activation in language areas that would indicate the person was hearing information. Interestingly, they responded to forward language, but not backwards gibberish, which meant that they were maybe processing language. But we got a better response when family members, a familiar voice, read the narrative than if it was just, you know, a random person from the office or from the lab. So you know, I think the important thing to remember, and we saw this in our DBS study, that people are that there's something that we have, their personhood is there. And we have to, it is our obligation ethically, I think, to find out who that person was in order to find them, you know, after their injury and make the connection with them. I remember when I was a medical student, probably the patient I got to know best when I was on psychiatry was a woman who was psychotic, and she had her own language, and colors meant different things to her. So I'd say, "So you mean orange?" And she said, "Yeah, orange." And I knew orange was a certain set of experiences and emotions, and she didn't change her language. She still said orange for whatever that was, but I had to become fluent at least in her idiom. And I think we have this kind of obligation to try to understand who these people are and establish modes of communication with them. You know, it's interesting because from the, you know, the ADA and the disability rights point of view, you know, if you have a motoric disability, you know, it's the ramp on the sidewalk or the elevator in a room like this that gets you into the room, right? For people who have a, you know, who have a brain injury, it's establishing functional communication so they can communicate with each other and enjoy the relationality of being with other folks. And language is key to that. And language is the holy grail here. So we have to try to understand who they are and speak their language.
So before we go to a question online, so just to follow up a little bit on that question, do we know what kind of thought processes are involved? So I can imagine, for instance, saying to a patient, you know, if your name is Dr. Joseph Fins, think about tennis. If your name is Robert Klitzman, think about your mother, and seeing, in other words, that kind of additional processing and sort of thought processes going on. I don't know if work like that's been done.
Well, I mean, I think that the challenge with that is there's an if then there, right? So is that if you're Joe Fins, if you're Bob Klitzman, think this or that, it's harder than think this or imagine playing tennis. So the multiple challenges are complicating. So I think the problem is that the metrics on this are that sometimes people, here's a confounder, somebody who can do the task in real life, I could say, show me your thumb. Show me your thumb. imagine showing me your thumb. I can't do it. Right. So, like this would seem to be easier or harder than the other. And so we're still trying to understand the metrics. And this is going to your question, we have to personalize this. There's some patients, like I remember one patient, what was their behavioral manifestation of self? They stuck out their tongue. Right. So, if you have to learn what the is for that person,
Right.
in order to establish the narrow channel of communication, and hopefully we'll broaden it.
Right, I guess, and we'll go on another question in a moment, but just there's whether there's activity and then what kind of activity
Right,
and how
right.
much activity, et cetera.
Right. And activity engenders activity. Well, it's
Right.
like learning,
Right.
right? There's a
So
question.
we're gonna go to online.
Oh, online.
actually.
Okay.
We'll go back and forth.
The next question is from Susan Labard. Can you imagine a future where patients can request in an advanced directive that an EEG or fMRI be performed to rule out CMD before withdrawing life-sustaining treatment?
I can imagine that happening this afternoon after hearing this talk. Whether or not it would be actualizable and realizable, but I think that's the vision, right? But again, I don't think we need to establish a higher bar to withhold or withdraw life-sustaining therapy, because we might know enough just based on the person's preferences. I'm not trying to be a vitalist here at all. What I'm trying to do is, if we're thinking about this under, the refusal of treatment under the rubric of informed consent and informed refusal, we have to determine how much information is necessary for that person to be adequately informed. I think
Now we'll go
the
back to
lady up there in
room.
the
Yes.
green, yeah.
So this is Diana Rodriguez.
Hi. Who is also a great neuroimager and an old-time collaborator.
I mean, I'm so happy to see the advances that have been done on the last years. And I'm curious if you and Nick were thinking on, doing different stimulation is interesting and it's great because you really change how the brain is working, but it's not feasible for a lot of people and it's not very practical. Are you kind of thinking on maybe other methodologies like TTCS, TMS, other things that can be, more broad use and also maybe earlier on than, what would be the time to
So,
do it?
I mean, DBS is an invasive procedure, it requires a neurosurgeon and, stereotactic localization. But people are doing transcranial magnetic stimulation, ultrasound directed at the thalamus. The thing is that it's less directed, it's less precise, and it's not ongoing. But I think ultimately there will be less invasive ways of stimulating the thalamus. Drugs, there are also drugs like amantadine, which accelerate the recovery of consciousness. But this is, Lewis Thomas came up with the phrase halfway technology. So the iron lung, the ventilator, was a halfway technology to the cure of polio, which was the Salk and Sabin vaccine, right? So this is still a halfway technology. We're demonstrating a way to engage the brain, but we're still at the beginning of the first chapter. And hopefully we'll have more accessible and more, and cheaper. Moore's law, right? It will get cheaper over time and it will get more accessible, assuming we can develop the technology.
So we'll go back to online.
All right, the next question is from our very own core faculty, David Hoffman. He asks, hi, Joe.
Hi, David.
Can you comment on the broader lesson of medical humility that we ought to draw from your work on disorders of consciousness and fMRI findings?
So I actually wrote there's a book by Michael Lockshin, who's a rheumatologist at Cornell, who wrote a book about diagnoses that have no name. And I wrote a chapter in that book about nosological humility, the very same topic. And I like to say to medical students that there are more diseases that don't have names than do have names. And when I was a medical student, there was no minimally conscious state. There was the vegetative state. There wasn't a permanent vegetative state yet, which is now the chronic vegetative state. So we're getting more and more, precise in classifying our world. So I think we have to have humility and have a degree of uncertainty about what we know, because it's all contingent and we're going to learn more over time. When I give a talk, a formal talk, I often have a slide of Vesalius at a podium slumped over a skull looking at the anatomy. And I, in the 16th century, that was the state of the art. And I take the same pose and I say, well, 300 years from now, 30 years from now, what I'm saying is going to sound very primitive. And that would be if everything goes the way it should go.
So time for one last question in the room, but then I think Dr. Finns may be around for a few
Yeah.
minutes if people want to come up and ask questions. Let's have someone hasn't asked a question. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just curious if any of your subjects were neurodivergent. Sometimes there can be language processing difficulties. And so, yeah, I was just curious if any of your subjects were neurodivergent and how you approach that.
In our small studies that I'm aware of, I don't think anybody had that diagnosis, but it's a small sample. But being brain injured is being neurodivergent. Post hoc, you're neurodivergent, and so I think the kind of what I was saying about accommodation and trying to understand the other is what I think dealing with folks who are neurodivergent is all about. Communicating, and I think that is true for this entire population. Because if they weren't neurodivergent going in, on coming out, they have these kinds of challenges, and it imposes an obligation on us to take better care of them and listen carefully to what they're saying and understanding what they mean.
Well, I want to thank you, Joe, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And just as a reminder, please follow us on Bioethics here at Columbia. And I should just say we have wonderful videos of previous speakers. Tony Fauci, I did a conversation with about a month or two ago, and others. We also have courses and degrees in bioethics online in person if you're interested. And again, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And read Joe's book. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you all
Bob.
for
Thank
coming.
you.